Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today on how migrants can be protected. I know that we have people joining from very different places in the world, so it might be the morning for some, the afternoon, the evening. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you. Today we have three great presentations. The first one is from Danielle Salazar on advocacy on U.S. protection and pathways for climate displaced persons. Daniel is the Refugee and Protection Policy Advisor from Global Refugee, a national refugee and resettlement agency, an international NGO based in the United States. He conducts policy and advocacy work on climate displacement, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and Afghan and Ukrainian resettlement. Then we have Felipe Navarro, Protection in Practice, with a presentation called Protection in Practice, using the law to support climate displaced people. Felipe is a Colombian lawyer with extensive experience in human rights, specializing in migration and refugee protection as the Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Center for Gender, Refugee, and Refugee Studies, Primary Research, Legal Advocacy and Training Institute. He spearheads human mobility-related policy initiatives and advocacy efforts across the Americas, including on climate displacement. And then we have a presentation from Alexander Aleynikov. I hope that I'm pronouncing it right. If not, please, Mr. Alexander, you can correct me afterwards. Presentation on climate-induced displacement and the international protection of forced migrants. Alex is the executive dean of the New School for Social Research. He has written widely in areas of migration, refugee law and policy, translation law, citizenship, race, and constitutional law. So I welcome all of you and all of our speakers as well to this very exciting and important discussion. My name is Stella Aragon, and I am Knowledge Coordinator for the Climate Mobility Academy for the Global Center of Climate Mobility, and I'll be the moderator today. So without more further ado, I will give the floor to our first presentation from Danielle Salazar. Danielle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stella. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just confirming that you can see my slides or see the slide.
We can see it, yes.
Great. Well, thank you, and good afternoon or evening, everyone, wherever you're joining from. I'm grateful to join this esteemed panel to discuss advocacy on U.S. protections and pathways for climate displaced persons. As Stella mentioned, I'm a policy advisor at Global Refuge. We are a refugee resettlement agency in the United States, formerly known as Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. So we are a US-based nonprofit or non-governmental organization with field offices in the United States, as well as international programming in Mexico and Guatemala. I conduct congressional advocacy, administrative advocacy to various US federal agencies, multilateral engagement, as well as research and analysis on this issue, as well as other major humanitarian topics like refugee resettlement. This has been an important topic for LIRS and then Global Refuge. LIRS published a report in July 2021 to discuss the protections and pathways available for climate displaced persons. And this presentation is a bit of a preview of a forthcoming update we have to that original publication. LIRS and then Global Refuge has maintained a list of resources and talking points guidance that aid our supporters in drawing attention to this issue. Our president and CEO, Krishamara Vignaraja, is also a member of the Climate Migration Council and frequently uses her platform and external speaking opportunities to talk about this issue and the wide gap of the risks that climate displaced individuals face and the policies in place to support them, including through efforts like congressional briefings and presentations like this. So we come at this issue, from a refugee protection lens, a lens of supporting immigration relief, primarily in the United States, as well as from a place of faith-based mobilization and advocacy. And so our approach to this issue, is on a number of different premises rather. The first being that climate-related displacement needs dedicated pathways. While obviously climate mobility manifests in a number of different ways, we believe it creates significant humanitarian considerations and that the most optimal policy response involves specific humanitarian protections or pathways that are based on climate rather than a sort of ad hoc application of other methods such as family reunification or labor pathways, although those are obviously very important to this conversation, but not issues that we necessarily lead on. That said, we have to acknowledge that other humanitarian regimes and programs remain relevant in lieu of climate-specific protections. Until the laws and policies that are in place are changed, we have to work with the laws and policy in place as they are. And so looking at ways that other mechanisms, such as asylum, temporary protected status, refugee status, how those can help close the protection gap in the United States. And then finally, as immigration groups too, just recognizing that we need to support action in other areas and how we need to stray outside of our traditional focus on immigration relief and the US refugee program to make headway on this issue. And with that, being mindful of the silos that we're traditionally operating in, the jargon we use, and how we can branch out into other areas of policy and advocacy. And in particular, by affirming the work that's already being done, right, by partners, by orgs on this call, like CGRS and GCCM, while also seeing where our intervention would be valuable as well. And so with that, I'll begin with legislative advocacy and how legislative advocacy in the United States Congress can cover a number of different areas, including appropriations that support and fund US government programs, oversight of federal agency activities, as well as resolutions of support. But in this section, I'm going to focus on one specific bill, the Climate Displaced Persons Act. In the United States, there's no climate-based pathway in immigration law. As I'll cover in a couple slides, there are other programs and protections codified in US immigration law that are relevant to expanding protections to individuals affected or displaced in full or in part due to climate change. Those include asylum, refugee status, temporary protected status, humanitarian parole, but no climate-specific humanitarian mechanisms at this point to facilitate entry, admission, or regular status. But lawmakers over the last 6 years have proposed changing that through this proposal, which is the primary legislative proposal in this space in the United States, as called the Climate Displaced Persons Act, or CDPA. It was first introduced in the spring of 2019 by Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts. The CDPA calls for the creation of a climate-specific humanitarian visa to facilitate entry and admission of climate-displaced persons. It would also call for the creation of a global climate change resilience strategy to centralize a coordinated all-of-government approach to improving climate resilience of affected communities. Some rather impressive work went into the last update of the CDPA from a variety of different groups to ensure the CDPA and its pathway would be open to those who are displaced by slow onset events, those who are displaced by climate change in the context of other factors, and that the visas in the CDPA are coming specifically from climate vulnerable countries, basically making sure this proposal is reflecting the latest and greatest information and thinking in the space, particularly when it was introduced or last reintroduced in 2023 with lots of developments on adaptation, loss and damage, and other topics. And so from an advocacy standpoint, the CDPA has a number of different strengths to it. It is a valuable messaging and mobilization tool on this topic, in part because it takes numerous different aspects or threads in this space on resilience and pathways and regularization and gathers them into a single legislative proposal. It's been reintroduced and refined for 3 sessions of Congress at this point over the last 6 years, and gained quite a bit of attention, particularly with its first introduction in 2019 as a rather groundbreaking proposal. So it's an important tool to mobilize supporters and advocates. It's one that staff members on the Hill are aware of at this point when it's been reintroduced several times, 2 different times since its original introduction. And it carries with it, messaging about how we as practitioners and advocates examine this issue, which is also helpful when champion offices like Senator Markey's office is rather receptive to the suggestions and the input of civil society on the CDPA. It's also gained support from various different groups at the local, state, and federal level, and also across sectors when we're talking about refugee advocates, immigration groups, climate groups, and others. On the flip side, to this point, it's been unable to gather bipartisan support. The only co-sponsors that have signed onto this bill in any of its iterations are Democratic officials, so no representation from the Republican Party. We also find that a pathway to passage will be challenging, if not impossible, in the years ahead. And that's certainly the case in the current policy environment with the policy orientation of this presidency, this administration, and this Congress that began in January. But it was also true to a large extent in previous sessions as well, which had more favorable orientations to these issues. And that's in part because immigration relief, regularization proposals, including for those who are already here, have faced obstacles, whether it's comprehensive immigration reform or also more targeted policy proposals like regularization of certain humanitarian groups, such as Afghans who were evacuated in 2021. It's also been caught up in harmful narratives, and as we've seen, immigration proposals in the current moment inevitably get tied to discussions about entry and admission at the United States southern border with Mexico. And so we've already seen members of Congress opposed to this bill use harmful narratives to talk about how this sort of proposal would inundate or flood the country with immigrants, which is deploying the same sort of messaging that we see and run into in other areas as well. And so with that, I do want to turn to administrative advocacy, which is how we as advocates encourage the United States and its various federal agencies to build protections for climate displaced individuals. I'm going to focus mainly on U.S. refugee policy and temporary protected status, although the report will also discuss the use of humanitarian parole and asylum. It is important to contextualize administrative advocacy, particularly as it's taken place over the last several years. In 2021, the Biden administration released a report on the impact of climate change on migration. It was significant at the time because it was the highest level review a US government had taken or done on the links between a changing climate and human mobility patterns. In the run-up to that report, as well as in its aftermath, civil society groups have engaged the White House, Department of State, and other actors on following through on boosting protections for climate displaced individuals. And so while this report was an important moment, a lot of advocates were and other civil society groups, I think, were disappointed somewhat in terms of a lack of progress following the report when it did come out in October of 2021 for the remaining 3 years of that administration. And as advocates and as policy practitioners, civil society sought follow through on some of the commitments that the administration had made to advance on this issue. So a good example of that is when the State Department and its Refugee and Migration Bureau, PRM, came out with its climate change strategy in 2023, which included on this slide, as you can see, a priority to strengthen protection for various groups, including through the U.S. refugee program. And that last clause and phrase is kind of important, of including through the U.S. refugee program. So that sort of reference encouraged advocates, encouraged civil society to think about how to push on the threads of how can existing programs deliver, even if we don't have a climate-specific pathway in U.S. law. And so with that, various organizations supported the rebuild of the U.S. refugee admissions program, which has been the interagency system that vets, processes, resettles, and supports refugees in the United States. It's codified in the Refugee Act of 1980. Refugee status determinations are made on persecution or based on persecution or well-founded fears of persecution on certain protected grounds, including race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So it doesn't at least in the US kind of conceptualization in law and in policy, it doesn't include a more expansive definition of who would necessarily qualify for refugee status. So advocates pushed during the Biden years for the administration to use some of its tools, both existing tools and also new programs to encourage resettlement in a climate sensitive or climate specific way. So for example, creating priority groups of refugees who are in climate affected settings, such as South Sudanese or refugees from Burma, using regional processing initiatives, such as the Safe Mobility Initiative or Safe Mobility Offices, SMOs, in Latin America to think about how we improve refugee processing in a climate sensitive way, particularly from Latin America. Leveraging, again, another new tool of leveraging interest in private sponsorship, community sponsorship of refugees, and whether that could be deployed in a climate sensitive way. Unfortunately, advocacy on this program has faced strong headwinds this year. It's a program that, well, first off, the bureau in the State Department that led a lot of this work, PRM, has faced numerous different cuts to its personnel, as well as a potential change in its mission moving forward, more focused on other areas. This program has largely been suspended since January with very minimal arrivals, and the administration is poised to set the lowest refugee admissions target in the program's history, going back to 1980. We've seen integration support cut off for refugees, both from the administrative side of refugee cash and medical assistance being cut in the spring, as well as access to other services being cut in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was approved in early July of this year. It also has not enjoyed the sort of bipartisan support that it's traditionally seen in recent years. And so moving on from a permanent pathway, moving on to temporary protections, those also must remain relevant in lieu of kind of climate specific programs. One that comes up in the space is temporary protected status, or TPS, which can be declared for countries that experience conflict, disasters, or other conditions that render returns unsafe. It provides protection from removal and access to work authorization for nationals of designated countries. That said, it too has been under a profound rollback in 2025 as the administration and the Department of Homeland Security in particular removes those protections for nationals of various countries, including Venezuela, Haiti, Afghanistan, Cameroon, and others. One option worth noting, maybe in the years ahead, may be deferred enforced departure, or DED. This is a protection that's similar to TPS in that it provides protection from removal and access to work authorization for nationals of designated areas. It's been used less frequently, so it's not been subject to the same sort of campaign we've seen throughout the year of revocations and cancellations that TPS has. And it's also much more at the discretion of the president as part of their foreign policy decision-making. So a future administration could theoretically use this tool far more flexibly to protect individuals immediately after a climate-related disaster. And so progress on these pathways and protections will remain difficult in the years ahead for a variety of factors that people on this call are likely well versed and well familiar with, and that we face a hostile policy environment where even pathways and protections that were traditionally much more supported are in retreat. Funding for resilience programming faces huge gaps amid the dissolution of USAID and larger trends among donor countries. We continue to see harmful narratives demonize this population or worse, inspire negative or harmful policies in response. And various responses continue to need to make progress on centering and including the voices of those most impacted, which is those who are at risk of displacement themselves. And so, as refugee resettlement agencies, as other civil society groups in the United States, we need to make active headway and be more active on these other areas of policy outside of immigration relief, given the broader context. So that includes supporting the right to stay. That includes supporting safe and voluntary reintegration and return where possible, particularly with third country resettlement under attack, the right to seek asylum also facing potential rollbacks. Return and integration will be an increasingly important, durable solution if done safely and voluntarily. And we need to ask if people have the supports they need to find housing, to find employment opportunities, to find psychosocial support and other critical support. Localization and inclusion are also incredibly important, as I know a panel covered yesterday, but refugee-led organizations, community-based organizations, they're really closest to the community needs, but they're not given the appropriate resources or access to decision-making circles when it comes to climate adaptation and resilience. And so we should support their capacity building and the removal of those obstacles that prevent their more effective inclusion. Strategic litigation will be particularly important given the ICJ advisory opinion over the summer regarding the obligations of states in the context of climate change, particularly on non-refoulement and involuntary returns. And then as advocates, we can do a better part of being disciplined in our framing, not inadvertently doing harm to this issue based on the narratives we use, based on the data we use, and also to track and support subnational responses, including at the state level, at least in the US context, at the state level, such as Illinois passing a bill on a climate displacement task force on future resource and future community resilience needs. In that state, in the American Midwest, the American Great Lakes region that is planning for more inbound migration. So I do say, as Global Refuge and as Daniel Salazar personally, if you want to connect, if there are future areas of collaboration, we'd be happy to support your efforts and partner on these areas of joint agreements. So with that, grateful for this opportunity, grateful for Western Michigan University and its partners, and looking forward to the rest of the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for this very interesting presentation. We will now give the floor to our second panelist, Felipe Navarro, to discuss protection in practice using the law to support climate displaced people. The floor is yours, Felipe.
Thank you so much, Estela. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can you confirm you can see it, Estela, please? Yeah. Okay. I see you there. Well, hi again, everyone. I'm Felipe, and I work for, as Estela mentioned, for the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California, College of the Law in San Francisco. Today, I want to talk about how existing legal frameworks, mainly international human rights law and international refugee law, can be used as a tool, as one of the tools in the response to climate-related displacement. And to do that, I'll share insights from a resource with a very long title, which is the Practical Toolkit on International Protection for People Displaced Across Borders in the Context of Climate Change and Disasters, which I co-authored. And as I sort of discuss that resource, I want to explain how it helps us understand and apply very broadly existing legal frameworks to protect impacted communities. I'll start to give you a sense of where I'm going. I'm start with a bit of context and some of the common myths or perceptions that we hear around climate-related displacement and the applicable law. Then I'll introduce the practical toolkit. I'll explain a little bit about it, and I'll talk about the toolkit's 5 key considerations. And then I'm going to try to connect this resource with recent events like the advisory opinions. Daniel mentioned the advisory opinion of the ICJ, but there's also the Inter-American Court. And then sort of after that, I'll highlight how this opens, along with other events, opens opportunities for advocacy, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the focus of my work mainly. I won't extend myself too long here. I think we all know, because we're in this conference, that displacement linked to climate change and disaster is not a future concern. It's happening right now. We know, according to data, that in 2023, there were 20.5 million new displacements caused by conflict and violence. And an even higher number was displaced by disasters. I want to point out that those numbers only cover people displaced within their countries, but we know that some people have been forced to move across borders, though the data on that remains limited. The figures also don't capture where conflict, violence, and disasters combine, which, as we also know, often happens. But I think the message is very clear. Natural hazards, disasters, and climate change are already having a major impact on global displacement. And those numbers can be expected to rise as temperatures increase, sea level rise continues, and extreme weather events become more frequent and severe. And In the face of that, some people will continue to move because their lives are affected by these harms, and others will move preemptively to avoid that harm that can materialize in the future. When it comes to displacement, when it occurs across borders, there's been a real evolution in how we think about international protection. And by international protection, I mean that kind that comes from international instruments like the Refugee Convention and its protocol, as well as other international human rights treaties. For the longest time, there has been resistance and an assumption that these frameworks, existing refugee and human rights frameworks, had little to say about people displaced by climate change and disasters. And it is true that these instruments were not designed with climate impacts in mind. But over time, we've seen how their principles can still be relevant when those impacts intersect with other risks like persecution, which is relevant for the Refugee Convention, or serious harm. But there are also other broader myths that I think these assumptions reflect, like the idea that disasters are purely natural events or that they affect everyone in the same way. It is also common to think that climate-related displacement happens in isolation, disconnected from social or political factors. And even when international protection is considered, when we do agree in an instance that a person might be protected from climate impacts, protected from return to their country, I mean, it's often assumed that the danger has to be immediate almost, that people only qualify once their lives are already at risk. But over time, we've seen how climate impacts interact with existing inequalities and drivers of displacement, and that's part of what we sometimes call, and certain academics call, the hazardscape. That is the broader landscape of risk that people live within. So while there is no formal category of climate refugee as a legal term, there are people whose risk of persecution or serious harm is created or heightened by the effects of climate change and disasters. In the face of this, increasingly, legal practitioners and judges from around the world are grappling with whether and how the impacts of climate change and disasters may support an international protection claim. It's something that some practitioners are already facing in practice. A critical development in moving this thinking forward was a publication in 2020 of the legal considerations from UNHCR regarding claims for international protection made in the context of climate change and disasters. At my center, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, we took inspiration from UNHCR's work on this, and we developed a practice guide or practice advisory in 2023 that is focused on US law, and it shows practitioners here in the United States how to analyze and argue such claims considering climate impacts. And we do this by drawing on cases from our database of decisions here at the center. And after that, we took a next step by focusing on existing international and regional refugee and human rights law, showing how they have been or could be applied in cases in other countries. So we started with the US, but then we took that step back to look at the international framework. And what we found is that over the past decade, an important body of case law and guidance has developed in many countries that shows clearly how, in the right factual scenario, which is important, people can indeed qualify for protection as refugees or beneficiaries of complementary protection under human rights treaties in the context of climate change and disasters. I won't dive into these cases here. We discussed them in the toolkit, but they show that there is no need to make things overly complicated. It really shows us that the best option is to apply the existing protection principles to the facts of hand as one of the alternatives or tools that states have to protect this population. And that is why we developed the practical toolkit, which you can access through the QR codes that you see on your screen right now. By we, I mean myself and Kate Jastrom from the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, together with colleagues at the Calder Center for International Refugee Law in Australia and at the Essex Law School and Human Rights Center in the UK, which we did with the support of UNHCR. To draft this document, we also consulted wide consultations with a broad range of practitioners, judges, UNHCR officials, legal experts from across the world, including in the Americas, Africa, Europe, and the Asia-Pacific region. And what we produced, I think, is the practical toolkit resulted in a resource that provides a clear, detailed, and action-oriented resource for lawyers and judges that are tasked with assessing these international protection claims involving the impacts of climate change and disasters. And while it is geared towards practitioners and judges, I think it also has value for conducting advocacy depending on the context. The toolkit is accompanied by a shorter overview. It's a long document, so we produce a shorter version that you can also access through the other QR code that you see on your screen. In short, the toolkit analyzes, as I mentioned, international refugee and human rights law, and that means specifically in the context of the toolkit, the 1951 Refugee Convention, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture. And we also analyzed regional frameworks in Africa, the Americas, and Europe. I think one of the novel contributions of this resource is that provides this full analysis of how the regional instruments, which in many cases, at least in the cases of Europe and of Africa and the Americas, I think that open doors for protection in ways that are different from just based in the Refugee Convention, for example. I want to be clear that by this toolkit, we are working within the bounds of existing law. The toolkit focuses on how the existing legal criteria for international protection can apply in practice, as opposed to trying to reinvent the law or to extend it. And it is by drawing on this growing body of case law that I mentioned earlier that we introduce 5 key considerations, which are the 5 elements that we think practitioners should keep in mind when assessing protection claims involving the impacts of climate change and disasters. And these 5 considerations apply both on, are meant to be broad in general and apply both to refugee and human rights laws, and address common misunderstandings about how climate change, disasters, and displacement intersect in practice, and how the existing frameworks can respond. And again, I won't dive into each of the frameworks, of course, right now, but I will share the 5 key considerations to give you a sense of what we're proposing. The first of the 5 key considerations is that there are no special rules that apply for climate-related cases. The truth is that international protection claims involving these impacts, that is the impacts of climate change and disasters, should be assessed in the same way as all other protection claims, meaning there is not a special procedure. And the truth is that while there is no blanket rule that says that displaced people in the context of climate change or disasters will or will not qualify for international protection. It depends entirely on the circumstances. And it's also important to remember that these cases don't require a specialized understanding of climate science. What matters most is understanding that local hazardscape, that is the specific combination of environmental, social, and economic and political factors that create risk for the specific individual who's presenting a claim. The second key consideration is to look at that hazardscape that I mentioned as a whole. When people move in the context of climate change and disasters, as we know, they're responding to a combination of risks, not just a single event, although it can happen more often than not. It is a combination of things. And it's important to consider this full range of hazards that might shape someone's vulnerability. Like, are they already exposed to food insecurity, to weather scarcity, to health risks, to the loss of their livelihoods? The third key consideration is that climate change and disasters affect people in different ways. Factors such as age, gender, disability, health, or access to resources will impact how people experience and cope with the harm. Existing inequalities, of course, discrimination, exclusion can heighten the risk and limit access to assistance or protection. So in short, it is about understanding how these risks intersect across both environmental and social dimensions, in order to try to provide fair and rights-based approach to protection in these cases. The fourth key consideration is that human agency is relevant, and this goes to the concept of the natural disaster. While certain hazards are indeed natural, the actual risk of harm depends largely on how governments and other actors respond. It is human decisions, whether through action or inaction, that shape how climate and disaster impacts translate into real threats for people's life and safety. What matters for protection purposes isn't proving that humans caused a particular hazard, like that humans are behind climate change necessarily, but showing that human agency contribute to the risk of serious harm or failure to protect from it for a specific person or community. The final key consideration is to look at risk over time. We know that climate and disaster-related harm can happen suddenly or gradually, so protection assessments need to consider how risks may evolve. And the future risk is what usually matters, whether harm is likely to arise as conditions deteriorate or as governments fail to take the necessary preventative measures. And in that sense, as governments take preventative measures, measures for mitigation or adaptation, protection needs might be reduced, but if they don't, then protection needs may increase. So giving you that sense of what the picture of the toolkit includes, which I just sort of summarized a 50-page document in a few slides, I want to move beyond the toolkit and contextualize it in light of the evolving legal landscape. In the last 6 months, we've had a couple of advisory opinions that have significantly clarified how existing international human rights and environmental law applies to state obligations in the face of climate change. And one of them was the ICJ opinion that Daniel mentioned. The other one is the Inter-American Court's advisory opinion. And to different degrees, both touch on climate-related mobility. For the Inter-American Court, that advisory opinion recognizes very broadly and in strong terms that the climate crisis constitutes a genuine emergency, and the states have to respond under a heightened due diligence standard, meaning they have an active duty to prevent foreseeable harm, to respond effectively when it occurs, and to address the social and structural inequalities that amplify climate risks, including displacement. This decision, I think it offers the broadest treatment of climate-related mobility by any international court to date. And I think it importantly affirms that individuals, when we talk about cross-border displacement, the individuals impacted by climate change and disasters may in some cases be entitled to international protection. The International Court of Justice similarly also affirmed that countries must not return people to places where climate-related dangers could seriously threaten their lives or safety. And this sort of like aligns with or reinforces the UN Human Rights Committee decision in Tishiota versus New Zealand from 2020, which originally recognized that returning someone to a place where climate impacts endanger their life could violate their right to life under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. While these two decisions are extremely important and relevant, at the same time, they really stop short on providing guidance or explaining how the principles of international protection apply or could operate in practice. And I think that this is exactly sort of like in light of this evolving legal landscape that's reminded states of what their obligations are, where resources like the Practical Toolkit, and there are others out there that do provide guidance, can add value to move advocacy and protection forward. And by this, I mean that sort of like the advisory opinions, I think, create opportunities for advocacy. And I think specifically about the Americas with the Inter-American Court's advisory opinion, added to the Chile Declaration and Plan of Action, which was signed by 22 states from Latin America and the Caribbean in December of 2024, and that presents the most detailed regional commitment made to date on climate and disaster-related displacement. So this was done before the advisory opinion came out. It does take a broad approach to climate-related displacement, and it reaffirms the idea that we cannot return people displaced and by climate impacts back to situations of harm. And the declaration does call for access to asylum, complementary protection procedures, where climate change or disasters drive that movement. But despite of the good, like there's usually like an important side and a drawback. The declaration and plan of action use very ambiguous language, cautious language when referring to specific commitments, which I think sort of reflects the political reality that states are hesitant to fully embrace this obligation. For example, the plan stops short of clearly affirming that existing regional protection frameworks, particularly those relevant in the Americas, apply in this context. But in this sense, I think that the Inter-American Court's advisory opinion provides an important legal grounding for that declaration that preceded it. And it confirms that people displaced across borders in this context, as I've said, may qualify for international protection. And because the toolkit, because the Chile Declaration and Plan of Action is a plan meant to be implemented over the next decade in the Americas, I think that presents a real window for advocacy to shape how these commitments are put into practice in different jurisdictions in our region. Just to conclude, because I think I'll be out of time soon, the Practical Toolkit shows that existing international and regional protection frameworks already offered concrete tools for addressing displacement linked to climate change and disasters. And it is a tool the states must use. That said, I want to be clear that international protection is not the sole answer, and it's not going to be the solution for everyone who crosses borders in this context, but it should be a part of the response. As Daniel mentioned, climate mobility takes different forms, and some people will qualify for refugee or complementary protection, for example, while others will need different legal or policy pathways. But recognizing that diversity is key, so is ensuring that protection frameworks that exist today are used to their full potential wherever they apply. And again, sort of like recapping in the Americas, we see the Chile Declaration and the advisory opinion. I think that they create momentum in the region. And the challenge will be turning those commitments into practice. And that's where I think that resources like the toolkit, again, can add value. Our toolkit was designed to be adaptable. It can inform national approaches and inspire context-specific guidance. For example, CGRS has done it for our resources here in the United States. And we have, as well as other organizations, have done similar work in the US. And we know that our colleagues in Australia, for example, will develop guidance for their country before the end of the year, which we see as very valuable. And we understand that the toolkit has already been used by judges in the New Zealand system. So it's a slow progress, but I think it sort of shows us a way of using the tools that we have right now that, while imperfect, might bring relief to some people. And I will leave it at that, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Felipe. And now we will move on to our last speaker before we start the Q&A session. We are now having lastly our speaker Alexander Aleinikov to discuss on climate-induced displacement and the international protection of forced migrants. So, Mr. Alexander, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't have slides to show you, so you just have to listen. So what I want to talk today is about a fundamental paradigm shift in the way we think about climate migration. And I want to contrast this with the two discussions we've just heard, which are really important in terms of protecting people who have fled and pointing out the relevant norms that might be there to protect them. But I'm going to argue will ultimately be inadequate for the job ahead of us. You know, the early ideas with climate migration going back 10 or 20 years when people started talking about people forced to flee because of the effects of climate change was, well, let's just amend the Refugee Convention and put in a provision saying people who have fled across the border and can't go back because of climate should be protected. That effort was pretty quickly given up because it was recognized that most of the movement would be internal to a country, not across border, because the definition of persecution didn't work. It didn't really fit into the convention model. But there are other norms here that might apply. Felipe pointed them out. There are human rights norms, the IDP guidelines, there are regional instruments like the Cartagena Declaration, and even occasionally a refugee claim can be made under the Refugee Convention under sort of narrow situations. But generally, we don't have norms that protect climate migrants. And so therefore, we need to think about new ideas. And that's what Daniel was talking about, the Climate Displaced Persons Act, use of temporary protection, use of humanitarian parole. These are existing tools in the toolkit, if you want to put it that way. But they would be applied now for people who are forced to flee. My general claim is going to be that these continue to be generally implications or extensions of the existing refugee paradigm. And what I mean by that is refugee paradigm deals with people after they've been displaced and across international borders. And in fact, I was noticing in the slide on the toolkit that Felipe had that one of the conclusions was that cross-border climate displacement can trigger protection. I mean, that's the idea, that you fled across the border because of climate displacement, and we either have tools that might help you, or we should be developing tools that will help you. And what they all should be doing, not only providing protection in terms of taking care of you and assistance, but they should prevent your return. That's the norm of non-refoulement, and that's the core norm of the refugee regime, that you shouldn't be sent back to a place where they'll be persecuted on one of 5 grounds, which you probably all know. So it's movement across the international border and then preventing return. And as I say, that can help some people who move because of climate. There are some people who will cross international borders. The general, press and the scare stories here is that millions of people will be leaving the global south to come to the global north because of climate, and therefore either we have to stop it or we have to build new protections for people fleeing this way. But it's been said here in other parts of the conference here, this is not the story for most climate migrants. Most will flee within their home country, and in fact, one of the greatest harms may be for people who can't flee at all, who are involuntarily immobile. So rather than borrow from the refugee regime, the two concepts of having crossed the border and the norm of non-refoulement, the right not to be returned, I think we should shift paradigms and learn from the climate justice movement. And that starts with the recognition that it is unjust that people are forced to flee from their homes due to the effects of climate change, unjust because they are not responsible for the harms that are forcing them to flee. They're living in homes they want to remain in. Other things around the world, CO2 emissions, generally even not from neighboring states, but certainly not from their own states, have caused a change in climate that will be visited upon them. They are the victims of the wrongful acts of others. That's what brings in the justice consideration here. So this has important implications, and I want to talk about 3 of them briefly. The first is rather than conceptualizing the fundamental right as a right not to be returned on account of persecution, as the refugee regime does, I think we should start by conceptualizing a right not to be displaced. Now, you saw in Daniel's list, there were some opportunities for future development, and he listed very quickly a right to stay. But for me, rather than making that one of the 5 or 6 opportunities for development, I would make that the core right as we reorient a paradigm, a legal, and a normative, and a political paradigm for protecting people harmed by the effects of climate change. Now, this regime would still include the right of non-refoulement, because if someone has fled across a border to another country because of climate, it would be unjust to send them back to the situation that forced them to flee. But that would be a corollary, an implication, a result of the general right here, the right not to be displaced. And look what the right not to be displaced does, what work it can perform in a new paradigm. First of all, it would easily encompass people who are flee internally inside their country, which, as I keep saying, is the vast majority, well, the significant majority of people who will be displaced by climate. And they're simply left out of the refugee regime. And they were largely left out of the first 2 presentations that you heard. It was all about people who had crossed a border. And I don't think it doesn't make sense to me to work within a paradigm that leaves out the majority of people upon whom the harm has been visited. So I would start with the right not to be displaced, and it would include internally displaced people within their countries of origin. Second, if you start with a right not to be displaced, it immediately focuses you back on root causes of flight. The refugee regime takes people who've already fled across a border, and you're dealing largely with their situation in their country where they've achieved safety or along the route to safety. And if you think about it, it's a very odd thing. The rights that you receive under the refugee regime, which is a long list of really important human rights in the 1951 Convention, they apply against the state that has rescued you, right? These are rights in the state in which you have settled or gotten temporary refuge, a right to work, a right to practice your religion, a right to benefit from welfare laws, and all the various rights that are in the many provisions of the Refugee Convention. They're not rights against the people who caused the harm, and I will talk about that in a moment. So the right not to be displaced puts the focus back, not where it is in the refugee regime in the destination state, but rather on the root causes of flight. It makes us think about prevention. What can we do to help people be safe from being displaced? And what does it tell us in terms of resilience? If harm comes, how can people be resilient and stay where they are? And starts with the basic understanding and assumption here, which is also in the refugee regime, is most people want to stay where they have lived and grown up and maintain their residence where they are. And the harm is forcing them from those conditions that are so crucial to themselves, to their identity, and to their communities. The refugee regime, the refugee scholars for a while talked about root causes a number of years ago, but I'll include myself in that category of scholars, quickly recognized that refugee law and refugee scholars don't have a lot to say about the root causes of most refugee flight, which is conflict, the civil war, other kinds of wars, and that the refugee system is not adept at really working on those causes. If we start from the climate justice perspective, we actually start from a set of norms that have been developed in the climate area that deal with root causes, that start with trying to reduce CO2 emissions. That's the core promise of the Paris Accord, is that states sign up to actually reduce the causes of climate change. And where climate change has occurred, we start talking about adaptation and resilience, and attention is paid to ways to help people stay where they are. This is wholly absent in the refugee regime. Another reason I think the refugee regime is inapposite in this situation. And then thirdly, a violation of a right should lead to a remedy. It should lead to accountability for those causing the harm. Again, this is strange, but this is absent in the refugee regime. As I've said, the regime starts with someone leaving their home country and they're in another country, and the rights under the convention are the rights in that destination state. And there were rights that were put into the convention because the idea was that person should be helped to integrate into that new state and start over. But what the climate justice paradigm talks about is you have a right to stay where you are and not be displaced, and that those that are causing the harm to make you flee your home should be held accountable. Now, to some extent, I mean, I can say that there aren't great tools for making that happen now, but they're beginnings of this. So one can see in the lost and damaged discussions, the creation of a loss and damage fund in the two COPs, conventions of parties ago, was the creation of a loss and damage fund. There's a lot to work out in the loss and damage fund. It's not funded at appropriate levels, and it's not even clear it will apply in the situation of climate migration. But it starts with this very important recognition that those who have caused the harm should pay. The polluter pays principle, which I keep saying is not in the refugee regime. And that can be expanded. One can imagine, I think, a beginning perhaps in regional human rights courts, where there are hints now at the beginning of the recognition of a right to remain. And perhaps damage actions can be built into that. There are other kinds of lawsuits that were mentioned in the earlier talks that are trying to hold accountable large corporations that have contributed to CO2 emissions and to climate change, and states as well. Those are going to face a lot of challenges. Those are going to be difficult cases to bring. But I guess what I'm saying here is that the real work is going to be at the political level. It's going to be about mobilizing a political claim about a right not to be displaced. Now, none of that is to say that the work that has just been described by Daniel and Felipe is unimportant. It's really important. We have tools available to help people who have fled across the border, and we should be making use of those tools wherever we can. But I would urge here, while we are doing that, to think seriously about a paradigm shift that focuses on this right to remain, this right not to be displaced, this right to stay, and work for political principles that ultimately can be recognized in law and in courts that will help a far larger number of the people burdened by climate change than working within or working from the refugee regime. And as they say in Congress, I cede back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much for that reflection. It is certainly important when we discuss migration or when we discuss climate mobility to discuss immobility as well. And then we could also look at the focus and the lens of voluntary and involuntary, both mobility and immobility, because certainly there is a lot of dynamics that come into play. We will now open the floor to Q&A. So I invite all of our attendees and participants to share their questions in the Q&A tool that you have at the bottom of your screen. In the meantime, and actually building on one of the last comments that you made, Alexander, I would like to ask a question to all of the speakers, and it would be considering now in the light of recent developments and recent advisory opinions, including the advisory opinion from the International Court of Human Rights, are we getting closer to being able to hold states accountable? Is it actually going to be feasible to hold states accountable for not protecting those who remain, those who are trapped, who cannot move, because we have a lot of cases of that, and those who are being displaced due to climate change. So are we getting any closer, still considering also, I think that you all mentioned the fact that there are no clear guidelines on how to apply some of these advisory opinions. So perhaps I would give the floor first to respond to Daniel, then Felipe, and then Alexander.
I was going to offer that Felipe might be able to answer this first, but
no, absolutely.
You.
Felipe, if that's okay with you, we can go with you first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a great answer. I do think that if we think in the context of the Americas and the advisory opinion by the Inter-American Court, there is an opening, at least in paper, to hold states accountable, and hopefully with time and sustained advocacy and litigation that sort of like from paper can translate to practice. As I mentioned, that advisory opinion by the Inter-American Court is very broad in the way it understands and conceptualizes state obligations in the face of the climate emergency, including with that heightened due diligence standard that I mentioned. And it's been a minute since I read it, but they also talk about the responsibility. The court talks about the responsibility not only of states, but also corporations, which I think was a novel approach that they took in there. So I do think that at least now, and I'll focus specifically in the Americas, there are opportunities and avenues where people can challenge the actions of states for not protecting these rights.
Thank you, Felipe. Danielle or Alexander, would you like to comment on this?
Well, I mean, Daniel, do you want to go?
Yeah, so I guess I'd say, because it's not our focus of kind of the international, human rights kind of regimes. I mean, one of the reasons I defaulted to Felipe is because I was thinking, at least in the US context, of how, we need to be mindful about what cases and what arguments are made, and in part because CGRS did great work last year about a certain case in the United States about a claim for asylum on the phrase climate refugees, and how that argument wasn't kind of connected with broader fact patterns and whatnot. So I was thinking of a CGRS example as a way to kind of illustrate the point that it's important for the strategic litigation to look at the windows of opportunity and make sure that it's that they get the appropriate opportunities, essentially.
Yeah, so I think you will get there because I mean, the problem is too big. Too many people will be displaced, and you, as Felipe pointed out, you have you have these regional decisions which are talking about the harms, the violations of human rights that are occurring. And once you talk about violations of human rights, you have to talk about who the perpetrator is and how you might measure the harm. The problem here is it's in climate change, it's really hard to ever say that corporation X contributed this much CO2 and therefore has to pay that much to group Y that was forced in their country. I mean, the causation here is really, really difficult. And I think, I guess you could sue every oil company in the world. I mean, but the defenses by the companies will be, well, you can't show that it was my action that produced that harm. Yeah, well, I mean, we'll eventually get beyond. I think we will get beyond that. That's how law develops. I mean, there's a recognition here. Think where we were 10, 15 years ago on these cases and how much we've moved. So again, if we recognize a harm and we know who caused it, I can't help but think eventually there'll be some court cases that will try to hold people responsible to some level. That they may say so and so's responsible, but it's up to the international community to work out a system. And what we've done in Paris is we've said people have to stop contributing to the CO2 emissions, and eventually we're going to say, here's the harm that's been caused. You're all what we would say in American law, joint tortfeasors, jointly and severally liable, and we'll appoint a commission to allocate responsibility if we can. I don't think I won't predict that's going to happen, but I wouldn't find that surprising down the road.
Thank you for that answer, because there's certainly the question on accountability. Who is accountable? Is it your state? Are there the states that are contributing the most emissions? It's certainly something that is still not defined, and it's an issue that hopefully we'll get there. My next question would be to Daniel. So in your presentation, you talked about several challenges considering the current context that you are working on. You also presented some opportunities as well. And I would like to ask you if you had to prioritize one of those opportunities that you mentioned in terms of assessing feasibility as well as impact over the next following year, which one would you prioritize?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think certainly part of me has to think that in the current environment that narrative work is one of the most important things, because we've seen how harmful narratives change kind of the rules of the game, change the landscape in which immigration proposals can operate. And I say that because even widely popular efforts in the United States, such as regularization of certain immigrant populations that have been here for a long time, even, I mean, a lot of the advocacy work I've done separately is on the Afghan Adjustment Act and a bill to specifically, provide regularization for a humanitarian group that was brought here by the United States that has veteran support, faith-based support. And because of harmful narratives, those sorts of proposals can't move forward. So I think, I think the harmful narratives, the crisis narratives that I think can sometimes undermine the framing and the conceptualization of climate-related displacement as a whole, as Alex referenced, of there's this perception that it's millions of people crossing borders and that's the primary way that this trend manifests. I think that continued narrative will continue to make the rules of the game, the advocacy and policy work that we do at every level harder if we don't kind of rein in those narratives and replace them with messages of solidarity, rooted in climate justice, and other narratives that are more conducive to progress on that. Because other than that, I think every other topic, every other effort will be fighting uphill without that. So I think they're all important, but I think narratives and narrative work is probably one of the most crucial in the years ahead.
Thank you. That is certainly interesting because of the massive influence that narratives can have across so many different spheres. It's really, really interesting. Thank you for that great answer. I would like now to address a question to Felipe. So based on your presentation, one of the things that you highlighted was the fact, and I think it's also something that we have been all of us discussing throughout this session, is the fact that climate displacement is outside of the international protection frameworks. So we do not have specific tools to address this or to provide guidance on this. You created a toolkit. So I would like to ask two things. So on your opinion, would it be important to create more specific frameworks and international instruments that would provide better guidance on how to include and considerate climate displacement as part of international protections, as well as something that can be replicated and included in national law? Or is it just about creating guidelines and more practical tools for states on how to implement instruments that already exist? So I'm not sure if I'm getting my question across, but is it about creating more specific instruments, international instruments, or helping states to implement what already exists?
That's a great question, and something I've personally thought about a lot in the past. I mean, if we're going to talk about a new framework that would address climate displacement, then I would favor what Professor Leinikov is suggesting, sort of like shifting that paradigm and focusing on the root causes, focusing on the obligation to prevent that displacement, on the right to stay, on accountability. But in the meantime, I do think that also we have to use the instruments that we have at hand, and that is making extensive use of the existing refugee and international human rights instruments that we have at hand, and help states use them to their maximum capacity. I think that everything faces a similar challenge in the sense of that the political will to come up with a new paradigm, a different solution, but also the lack of political will to implement what we have in place right now. So I think that's where what Daniel was mentioning, for example, the work around narratives, the work around understanding how this displacement occurs, the true nature of it that I mentioned, the fact that it's mostly internal. I think that's sort of like, I'm saying basically all of the above. It's sort of like we have to work to change the narrative. We have to work to shift the paradigm to prevent this displacement, to protect people that are displaced internally or across borders. And while we do that, we also have to try to make the best use of the instruments that we have at hand to protect those who are forced across borders and need some form of protection.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, Felipe. It's certainly a comprehensive to such a complex issues. A comprehensive approach is always the most useful. My last question would be to Professor Aleynikov, and it's on you stressed on your speech on the fact that it is mandatory to make a shift in the focus and to stop focusing on or as much on movement, on displacement, on people seeing these as an issue of migration, of having to move away from where you are, and acknowledging the fact that a lot of people do not wish to move, and that it is unfair and unjust. This is an issue that GCCM looks into very closely as well. But my question would be, where do we start? Like, who needs to do this shift? Where do we begin? Is it the states? Is it in the academy? Is it in the way that we are talking and discussing about climate migration and climate mobility? Is it in the communities themselves that are the ones in the front lines of this issue, that are the ones deciding whether do I move, whether do I say, can I move, can I stay? So where do we begin?
Yeah, I'm not real good at politics, so I don't have a fabulous answer on this one, but I would say you'd start with the communities that are affected and hope they can organize politically. And then, as Daniel stressed and Felipe mentioned, you'd try to develop political narrative here, that works, that ultimately I think that cultural change will drive the legal change. So it would be every place you can try to change culture, and that can be art and music and plays, and I mean a whole range of things, as well as marches and politics at the local level. But you're beyond my abilities to be able to say exactly. I leave that to people who know how to organize others. That's not something I do. I don't think you'll get it from states. I don't think that's where it's going to start. It needs to start in civil society.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander. And if I could add on to that, one of the, because you started saying it needs to start with the community, is one of the things that we at GCCM also try to shine a light on, is on the fact that things, even very complex issues, if do not start ground up, even creating solutions and creating even legislation and these sort of instruments, it would not begin with consulting and building together with those that are at the forefront of this crisis. Nothing will work, right? So I want to thank all of you again for this very rich discussion. It was extremely interesting. I hope that it was the same for all the attendees that joined this session. So with that, we will close this panel. And again, thanks for all of those that are joining. Have a wonderful evening, afternoon, or night from wherever you're joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you.